Before Salem, there was a terror so intense, so all-consuming, that it forged the nightmare of witch trials long before they reached America. The dark truth of Europe's witch trials, the ones they don't teach you, began centuries earlier, and it's far worse than you can imagine. But before we dive into the madness, let's understand the roots of this fear. The first whispers that sparked a fire too deadly to put out. In the 1400s, across the shadowed hills of Europe, rumors began to spread, whispers of a terrifying new fear sweeping through villages in places like Germany, France, and the Balkans. The night air seemed to carry a warning, an unsettling unease that was impossible to ignore. In remote villages, where the dark forest met the wild fields, there were strange happenings that defied explanation. It began with the bodies. The graves were found torn open, the bodies face down in the soil. What once seemed like a simple burial had turned into something far more sinister. Villagers reported that the dead were rising, not as undead in the way of myths, but as something darker. Witches, they whispered, women who had been accused of practicing dark magic, of making pacts with the devil, women who were buried far from the others, cast away in disgrace. And now, they were returning, fueled by their unholy power. The fear was palpable. When one villager was found dead with bruises around their neck, others claimed it was the work of a witch. As the bodies piled up, the theories began to spread. There was a feeling that something terrible was at play. These weren't just ordinary deaths. They were the results of curses, of witches seeking revenge from beyond the grave. But there were those who refused to believe, who fought to dismiss the panic sweeping their homes. And it was here, in the deep-rooted superstitions of the old world, that the witch trials were born. Local leaders, priests, and those in power seized the fear, using it as a weapon to further their own cause. A woman with knowledge of herbs? A midwife known to care for the sick? She was a witch. A widow living alone? She was a witch. Anyone who stood out, anyone who seemed different, was an easy target for accusations. And the terrifying thing? Once accused, there was no escaping the judgment. Torture and death were the only absolution from the community's fevered grip. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. Something darker, more ancient. A force that was feeding on the fear and would soon reveal itself in ways no one was prepared for. Long before the witch hunts ravaged Europe, before the flames of accusation licked at the heels of the innocent, there was a time when people revered the earth, the moon, and the spirits that seemed to dwell between them. In the misty hills and forests of ancient Europe, people honored deities and spirits who were believed to control the cycles of life, gods of the harvest, spirits of the forest, guardians of the water and air. Rituals were performed with reverence, passed down from generation to generation. It was a time when magic was not feared. It was a part of life. Candlelit rituals took place deep in the woods or by the hearths of humble cottages. Women would dance in the moonlight, their voices joining in ancient chants that invoked the blessings of the earth. The herbs they grew in their gardens weren't just for cooking, they were tools of power. A pinch of sage, a handful of thyme, the petals of an evening primrose. These were ingredients for remedies, cures, and potions. To the people who practiced these arts, they were simply natural ways to connect with the world around them. These acts were seen as essential, even sacred, to their way of life. But in the shadows of these rituals, something darker was always lurking. The line between reverence and fear was delicate. The worship of nature's forces could just as easily be twisted into something unholy. As Christianity began to spread across Europe, the teachings of the church started to take hold, transforming these once sacred rituals into something insidious. The once innocent acts of worship now became demonized as witchcraft. The church declared the old gods false, the rituals blasphemous, and those who practiced them as heretics. What had once been a peaceful communion with the natural world now carried the weight of damnation. In the dark corners of villages, the whispers began. They gather in the woods at night, some would say. They speak with the devil, making pacts in exchange for power. Those who had knowledge of healing herbs, those who spoke to the spirits of the land, became targets. They were accused of communing with dark forces, of using their knowledge to wield unholy power over life and death. The unease that settled over Europe was subtle at first. There was an ancient reverence for these rituals, but it was now accompanied by a gnawing fear. The once celebrated witch trials were slowly taking shape, birthed from a society that could no longer distinguish between the sacred and the profane. As the church's power grew, it demanded conformity, forcing a darker narrative onto these once innocent practices. And yet, for all the discomfort, there were still those who clung to their ancient ways, even in secret, despite the growing dangers. Misty fields shrouded in morning fog became places where the unwelcome could easily hide. Candlelit rituals, once a symbol of peace and connection to the divine, now took on an air of danger as whispers of forbidden practices filled the dark corners of taverns. The stars in the sky, once the beacons of guidance, now seemed to mock those who dared to look up and ask for help. The land itself began to feel like it was watching, listening. Every rustle of the trees in the forest became suspect. Every shadow in the corner of a cottage, every flicker of candlelight was now questioned. And as the rituals continued, a new fear was taking root, one that would eventually consume Europe and give birth to a darkness far worse than anyone could have imagined. It began with small, inexplicable things that no one could easily explain away. A child, once healthy, suddenly falling ill with no apparent cause. A woman's crops, once thriving, withering overnight. The unnerving whispers of something unnatural in the air, something wrong, just beneath the surface of everyday life. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came when strange marks began appearing on the skin of the dead. At first it was dismissed, just some freak accident, some odd happenstance that could be explained away by sickness or old age. But then, as more and more bodies were found with the same strange marks, deep bruised indentations around their necks, or gashes in their palms, people began to wonder. No one knew how to explain it, but there was an unspoken sense that these were not natural marks. They weren't the result of disease. They weren't accidents. Then came the births. In villages where rumors of witchcraft had already begun to circulate, women started to give birth to malformed children, babies with strange, unnatural features that defied explanation. Some were born with twisted limbs, others with eyes that glowed unnaturally in the dark. And the people, the ones who had already been growing wary of the old ways, of anything that was different, saw these births as proof of a curse. They whispered that these were the children of witches, born of evil and unnatural acts, destined to carry the mark of the devil. But it wasn't just the children. Illnesses began to spread without warning. A whole village would fall victim to an inexplicable fever that no one could cure. Crops that had thrived for generations suddenly failed. One by one, animals began to drop dead in the fields, their bodies twisted and deformed as though they had been possessed by some invisible force. The signs weren't subtle anymore. They were impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before suspicion began to fester in the hearts of the people. Who or what was marked? Who could be blamed for these unnatural occurrences? It was only a matter of time before the whispers began. Accusations were made, fingers pointed. Those who were already on the fringes of society became the prime targets. Old women, widows, midwives, healers, anyone whose ways were considered strange or unfamiliar. The fear spread quickly, and soon, anyone who stood out in any way could be accused of witchcraft. The line between logic and superstition blurred, and the once sacred knowledge of herbs and remedies became tools of the devil. The entire village began to turn on one another. Trust evaporated. At first it was just small things, strange behavior, odd signs that no one could explain, but it didn't take long for the accusations to escalate. People began to see witches in every shadow, witches in every passing glance. They believed that the marks on the bodies, the sickened children, and the failed crops were all the work of dark forces, and that those forces had infiltrated their homes. That was only the first crack in the story. The fear that had once simmered beneath the surface now bubbled up, forcing its way into every corner of village life. It started small, with strange occurrences and whispered suspicions, but soon it grew too loud to ignore. The air itself seemed thick with dread, heavy and oppressive, like a storm just waiting to break. People no longer walked freely through the village. They moved in hushed, cautious steps, glancing over their shoulders as though the shadows themselves could reach out and grab them. It began with the neighbors. A woman, whose name had once been spoken with warmth in the village, was seen at the edge of the forest, her hands stretched out to the trees, her face twisted in concentration. The evening was thick with mist, and she seemed to be speaking to something, or someone, that no one could see. Her lips moved in an ancient tongue, unfamiliar and chilling. The village's children, who had once played in the fields with her, now looked at her with suspicion. The next morning, one of the village's best cattle was found dead in its pen. It wasn't the usual sign of illness. No, this death was different. The cow's eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, its body contorted in a way that suggested it had struggled violently in its final moments. The villagers gathered around it, whispering in hushed tones. "Witchcraft, they murmured. "The mark of the devil is on her." No one could explain it, but in their hearts they already knew the truth. And when another animal died the following week, another calf, its body left in the same twisted pose, it was no longer a coincidence. The village elders were called, and they too looked at the woman with growing distrust. Her face had been pale, her eyes deep and hollow, as if something dark had taken root within her soul. Soon it wasn't just livestock. The crops, once abundant and strong, began to wither. Wheat that had ripened well in the spring now wilted in the fields. The smell of rotting vegetation began to fill the air, and even the most experienced farmers couldn't make sense of it. They dug into the soil, searched for signs of disease or pestilence, but there was nothing, just earth, barren and cold. The village had always relied on its land to sustain them, and now it seemed that very land was rejecting them. Something was terribly wrong. Then came the strange behavior. People began to hear things at night shuffling in the darkness, like footsteps that weren't there, whispers that seemed to crawl out from the cracks in the walls. One night, a man named Eric, a quiet farmer who had lived in the village for decades, claimed he saw something moving in the trees just outside his window. He said it was tall, too tall, and that it had no face. He swore it was watching him, waiting. The next morning he was found lying unconscious on the floor of his cottage, muttering nonsense. His eyes, when they opened, were empty, like he had seen something too terrible to ever be undone. A chill swept through the village, one that no fire could warm. People who had once been friends began to eye each other with suspicion, and trust, the very foundation of village life, crumbled. Accusations started to fly. Neighbors turned on each other, pointing fingers, whispering in corners. "She was seen by the river, talking to someone," one would say. "Has been acting strange lately. I saw him standing by the woods at dusk, staring into the darkness," another would add. And when the first child was found sick, writhing in pain with no clear cause, whispers turned into shouts. "It's the witches," they said. "They've cursed us." The women who had lived on the fringes of the village, those with knowledge of herbs, of remedies, of healing, became the first targets. They had always been looked at with a mix of reverence and fear, but now that fear took hold, anything that couldn't be explained was blamed on them. When the women in question were questioned, their answers were twisted, their words taken out of context. No longer healers, they were now seen as harbingers of doom, poisoners of the land. One evening, as a full moon hung heavy in the sky, a group of villagers gathered in the square. It was silent, except for the wind rustling through the trees. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the very earth was holding its breath. In the distance, the candlelight of a ritual flickered. Some said it was harmless, a ceremony to honor the changing seasons. But others saw it differently. They watched in horror as the flames danced higher, casting eerie shadows over the village. From that moment on, it wasn't just the land that was sick. The people were sick with fear. The village became a prison, every shadow a potential threat, every corner a place to hide from the madness that had gripped them. No one was safe. Accusations were thrown without evidence, fear fed fear, and trust was nothing more than a distant memory. And from there, everything grew darker. As the terror of the witch hunts spread, a growing sense of powerlessness began to take root in the hearts of the villagers. The fear wasn't just in the air, it was in every step they took, every shadow that moved, and every whispered voice that called their name. Desperation began to set in. People who had once lived in harmony with the land now found themselves at war with something they couldn't see, something they couldn't fight with tools or knowledge. They had no weapons. only the things they believed would protect them from the growing darkness. Garlic, salt, and the charms of old became the last defense. People began to sprinkle salt around their homes, believing it would form an invisible barrier that would keep witches out. Garlic, once used for flavoring, now hung from doorways, windowsills, and even around their necks. It was said to ward off evil spirits and witches, though its power felt thin, like a fragile thread holding together the last remnants of their sanity. In the dead of night, groups of villagers would gather in secret, whispers of incantations, murmurings of ancient rituals long forgotten by the church, rising into the air like desperate prayers. They lit candles in the dark corners of their homes, tracing protective symbols on the walls with chalk. Some spoke of the old ways, the sacred rituals that had once been meant to honor nature's cycles, but now served as a last attempt at defiance. They gathered in hidden groves, away from prying eyes, to perform rites under the cloak of night, hoping the spirits of the earth would hear them and intervene. But even these measures, ancient and desperate as they were, felt insufficient. The night air, once full of the scent of flowers and harvest, now smelled of decay. No protective charm seemed to carry enough weight to hold back the ever-growing tide of suspicion and dread. The village elders, once wise and respected, could no longer offer solace. The prayers whispered in the darkness sounded less like hope and more like a vain attempt to halt an inevitable force. A sense of inevitability gripped the villagers, as though something far greater than their efforts was at play. The ritual gatherings became more frantic, more ritualistic, but there was no peace to be found. Even the sacred nights, the ones once filled with reverence for the earth's quiet rhythm, now felt cursed. The moon seemed to hang in the sky like a silent judge, bearing down on the people below, watching them from above with an indifferent gaze. The warmth of the hearth, once a comforting presence in every home, now seemed to cast more shadows than light. And in the midst of their growing panic, the witch hunts grew more organized. What had once been disjointed accusations and desperate cries for help were now becoming systematic. The church began to sanction trials. The local authorities, eager to seize upon the hysteria, turned suspicion into power. The villagers, caught in the web of fear and superstition, watched in horror as those they had once known, friends, family, were dragged from their homes, accused of crimes they could never defend themselves against. And yet, despite the terror, there was a small, faint flicker of resistance. It wasn't enough, but it was all they had left. The whispers of defiance, of those who questioned the validity of the trials, grew louder. But even as their voices rose, they were drowned out by the cries of those being taken away. The witch hunts had gained too much momentum. The village had become a place where the only law that mattered was the law of fear. But despite their efforts, despite the garlic, the salt, and the old rites performed under the cover of darkness, the tide of suspicion would not be held back. It surged, relentless and unforgiving. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed, the deaths that followed the witch. Trials were not just brutal, they were tragic, leaving a mark on the very land that bore them. But these were no ordinary deaths. They weren't peaceful endings to lives torn apart by fear. These were deaths that carried curses, curses that didn't end with the final breath. They were deaths that were meant to ensure that the soul would never rest. The villagers began to understand that death was not always the end. It was a terrifying realization, one that kept them awake at night, hearts pounding in the darkness. And with this understanding came a new kind of fear. The dead weren't gone. They lingered, they returned, and in their return they brought a terror that could not be undone. The first signs were subtle, strange noises in the night, footsteps echoing where no one walked. But as the days passed, it became clear. The dead were restless. Bodies that had been buried were now appearing in places they shouldn't be, outside their graves, in the fields, by the edges of the forest. People reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, figures that were almost human but not quite. The air became thick with dread, each breath feeling like an affront to something unseen. The villagers, terrified of these restless spirits, turned to ancient burial rituals. They believed that only by ensuring the bodies stayed pinned to the earth could they keep the dead from rising. Heavy stones were placed upon the chests of the corpses, pressing them down, a last-ditch attempt to weigh down the spirits and prevent them from clawing their way back to the surface. Iron nails were driven through the wrists, the ankles, and sometimes even the heart, hoping to keep the soul trapped, never to return. But despite these efforts, the fear persisted. Every night, the same dread-filled silence descended upon the village, and every morning there was more evidence that the dead had not gone quietly. The ground would shift in strange patterns, disturbed as if something below had moved. And it wasn't just the bodies of witches. People who had died under suspicious circumstances, those who had been accused and executed. There were rumors they had been cursed in death. The villagers had become convinced that these souls were angry, unwilling to be silenced even in death. One night, a mother reported seeing her son, who had died from a mysterious illness months earlier, standing at the foot of her bed. His skin was pale, his eyes empty, and his mouth was open as if to speak, but no sound came. He simply stared at her, unblinking, before disappearing into the shadows. The next day, she found his grave disturbed. The earth dug up around it as though something had clawed its way out. The whispers grew louder. The dead were coming back, not just to haunt, but to take vengeance. The more desperate the villagers became, the more extreme their measures. Some tied their loved ones to their coffins, certain that their spirits would seek revenge if not bound. Others drove stakes through the hearts of those they buried, hoping that the old ritual would keep the souls where they belonged. But no matter how many stakes, no matter how many stones, the fear grew. The belief that death could be defied, that it was not the end, grew stronger with each passing night. The boundaries between life and death were thinning, and no one felt safe, because some of the dead refused to stay buried. And then, one night, the whispers stopped. The ground trembled beneath the village, as though the earth itself was pushing something back into the world. The moon, full and cold, cast its light over a grave, where the stones had been moved, where the earth had been disturbed. And from the soil, something rose, a figure, twisted, broken, but unmistakably human. Its eyes were black, voids that seemed to suck the light from the world around it. Its skin hung in tattered, rotting strips, clinging to bones that creaked and groaned with each movement. The air thickened with the smell of decay, and the wind carried with it a chilling whisper, too faint to understand, but undeniable in its presence. The villagers, who had long buried their dead with the hope of silence, could no longer deny what had come to life. The thing they had tried to bury had returned, more than a curse, more than a spirit. It was the dead, walking, crawling back with vengeance in its hollow gaze. It was the manifestation of every fear, every secret they had buried, every whisper that had been swept under. The rug. Some say it still walks, moving between the living and the dead, and sometimes, when the wind picks up just right, the whispers can still be heard in the dark. Perhaps, after all this time, the dead never truly left.